coordinated with Jane Dryden. So Jane is professor of philosophy at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada, and she works in philosophy of disability, feminist philosophy, German idealism. Her current research concerns vulnerability and relational autonomy in the context of neurodiversity and gut issues, as well as ableist and healthist pressures to normalcy within gut microbiome research. The title of her talk today will be Cultivating Curiosity, Not Cure, Collectively Resisting the Imperative of Normalcy in Food and Microbiome Studies. Jane, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you so much. Just let me share. It was working before, so hopefully it works now.
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. All right, just need
Yep.
to click on a thing. Okay. All right, so hello. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Jane Dryden. I'm from Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada, in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And my ability to live and work here is governed by peace and friendship treaties all the way from the 18th century that predate the existence of Canada as a country itself. Thank you so much to the organizers. I'm so pleased to be here. I keep meaning to come to one of these and the timing never works out. So this one, like the timing had to, even though it's awkward in certain places of the world. And I'm very sorry about the bulky title. It made sense at the time. And it's basically the core of the presentation. Like everything is right there. So essentially what I'm going to say is existing research into the reciprocal effects of what we eat and the condition of our gut microbiome tends to be shaped by healthist and ableist assumptions about how we should be. In earlier work, I've referred to this as an imperative of normalcy, so I'm going to be building on that. Um, so far, I've been writing about kind of observing or diagnosing this imperative of normalcy that runs through research and dietary advice. But I thought I'd take advantage of this presentation opportunity to explore some kind of half-baked ideas, no pun intended, about how to approach resisting this imperative. So here's the plan. I'm going to say a little tiny bit about current research and popular awareness about food and the gut microbiome. Probably lots of us are going to say stuff about this. I then want to talk about how this is in fact shaped by healthism and ableism, and that's basically the first half. And then how to resist this imperative of normalcy while still wanting to like feel good. And also without falling into a well of wellness culture misinformation. So I think I have a glimmer of a response to it through a turn to community, but I'll very much welcome your thoughts when we get into the discussion section. So here's the start. As I said, given the focus of the symposium, it feels weird to kind of take the time to explain what the human gut microbiome is, but I've kind of made it a habit, so I'm going to do it. The human gut microbiome refers to the community of microbes living within our gastrointestinal tract. They influence our gut health and how well we're able to absorb nutrients from our food. The metagenomics technologies to analyze the massive data sets of the genomes of organisms are comparatively recent. And so there's been a huge boom of interest over the past couple of decades as we've developed these technologies. And a researcher described it in 2012 as, quote, like the beginning of the space program. So just a little bit of hype. Because of this, there's been increasing scientific and public interest in our gut microbiome's influence on the immune system, on diseases like cancer, diabetes, Parkinson's, on neurodiversity, and on our mental health. The connection between the gut microbiome and food runs pretty deep. The food we eat affects the composition of our gut microbiome and, as well, in turn, how we're able to digest certain things. Quick side note, it also runs deep on another level. Since the computing power for these metagenomics technologies is really expensive, research depends on public and private grants. And so this connects to the ability to commercialize the research. And one of the main private funders is Danone Research and Innovation, the yogurt people. So just quick little side note there. Microbiome therapies include probiotics, so-called friendly bacteria, prebiotics, which are fibers to feed the good bacteria, and FMTs, fecal microbiota transplants, which are communities of bacteria within stool of healthy patients administered to unhealthy ones. So microbiome research has generated an entire industry of dietary advice. Stephanie Moroney, an STS researcher, wrote a whole dissertation on this back in 2018 called Eat for Your Microbes, Reimagining Diet, Health, and Subjectivity in the Probiotic Present. So that dissertation exists. It's great. The examples have only proliferated since then, which we can see from the existence of this list of best gut health books in the center of the slide here. What many of these have in common is an emphasis on individual control, individualized control of the gut, and the belief and expectation that this kind of control is possible. Some make this obvious right in the title. So on the left, you see Justin and Erica Sonnenberg's The Good Gut, taking control of your weight, your mood, and your long-term health. And then on the right, you see Reset Your Gut, restore your digestive health, and lose weight with over 75 delicious recipes from Robin Youkilis. In that book, she tells us that learning to, quote, optimize your digestion is, quote, your gut secret to finding your best body, no matter what stage you are at in life. And I just want to point out that the book on the left is by scientists at Stanford's Department of Microbiology and Immunology, and the book on the right is by a wellness influencer, but the tone across the two is really much the same. We just see a lot of language around optimization and control generally. So in the past, I know, tiny self-promotion of an article I'm kind of proud of. In the past, I've described this as directed by what I call an imperative of normalcy, which creates expectations of cure and control over our body minds and devalues ones that don't meet the standard, that cannot be optimized and controlled. So ableism, as I see it, is a system that creates a hierarchy of body minds according to proximity to expectations of quote unquote normal health, behavior, and appearance, measured according to societally dominant norms. And then healthism establishes the achievement and maintenance of that so-called normal health, behavior, and appearance as an individual's primary responsibility. Drawing them together, the linking thread of the imperative of normalcy highlights the insistence on controlling and curing the body mind and the consequent devaluing of those who fail to live up to their ascribed individual responsibility, quote unquote, to meet that standard of normalcy. The imperative prioritizes achieving a normal body mind via individualized interventions and neglects possibilities of other ways of being in the world. And so microbiome therapies, and in particular the hype around them, really contribute to this myth that the body mind can be controlled, right? So it's like, oh, you've tried everything, but look, here's this new tool that's going to fix everything, et cetera, that we finally discovered. So I'll just say what I'm not doing when I think about how to resist this imperative of normalcy. I'm not saying don't try to take care of yourself. And I draw here on Eli Clare's really helpful distinction between cure and the ideology of cure. So cure can have benefits. I have a migraine right now. There's like things that I will do about that, right? So while cure can have benefits, the ideology of cure involves the unquestioned value placed on cure, which assumes elimination of trouble or abnormality must be the primary goal. So Eli Clare describes himself as having, quote, fierce anti-cure politics, but still writes, quote, without hesitation, I use antibiotics, ibuprofen, synthetic testosterone, appreciating everything they do for me. And a quotation that I always kind of come back to from Eli Clare's work that I just find really helpful is this one in the middle. I catch glimpses of a world where many kinds of body-mind difference will be valued and no one eradicated, where comfort, pain, well-being, birth, and death all exist. Cure promises us so much, but it will never give us justice. In this world reconfigured, cure may not exist, but if it does, it will be one tool among many. In this world, our body-mind desires will spread through us as vibrant and varied as a tall grass prairie summer. And I've got a picture of a prairie in the background for, you know, the vibes. So having said that, what happens if we think about our relation to our gut microbiome, not focused on optimizing or hacking it, but with curiosity? Curiosity about this world inside us and how we might sense its reactions. Curiosity about what might feel good for our particular bodies. Curiosity about what food habits might be worth trying. And I just want to say before I go on that there's a whole other universe in which I then develop this even further into like what is even curiosity, drawing, for example, on recent work by Perry Zern, which I found super interesting. Sadly, this version of this talk doesn't have that, but if we have a time machine, we can go to the future and pretend it was there. So, our understanding of food's effect on our gut microbiome is not so complete that we know exactly what will cause what. It depends on what strains of bacteria are already present, on the various relationships between them, what's the general makeup of microbial communities, and on our overarching dietary, lifestyle, environmental, and family habits. Much of the science is so new that results are still unsettled. Beyond eating a varied diet, including fruits and vegetables, there's not much that the average family physician can confidently suggest. And back in 2019, 2020, I did a series of interviews with folks about their gut issues and just the sheer variety of things that people had sort of tried that worked or didn't work or worked for a while or stopped working is just sort of really extraordinary. Like we just kind of don't know. So we might be open-minded and try things. One thing we might be curious about is what our microbial communities might be up to. And so here's an example. This article on the slide, which I think is really neat. So I've given you the full citation on the slide. So this article, Microbiomes as Companion Species, an Exploration of Dis and Re-entanglements with the Microbial Self. So in this article, Alice Beck draws on Donna Haraway's idea of companion species, as well as interviews with people who have experienced FMT transplants. She describes how one might conceive of a relationship with one's microbiome through corporeal communication, quote, the continual everyday awareness of the corporeal bodily functions as a way of communicating with the microbiome, end quote. So in this context, we might observe and experience bodily sensations as part of a corporeal dialogue, including reflecting on, quote, digestive sensations of gut pain, nausea, diarrhea, or bloating, end quote. She calls this a form of, quote, communicating with the microbiome to understand what the microbiome can, and cannot process and manage, a felt way of shared understanding. The emphasis is on the listening that takes seriously these bodily feelings as signs and responding with respect for and of the new microbiome, end quote. So, receiving FMT transplants is admittedly different from changing our diet and focusing on the food we eat, which is the focus of tonight's slash this morning's symposium. But I think we can still draw from it for the purpose of this symposium. We can think of exploring the different kinds of foods we might take in, exploring different fermented foods, exploring different amounts of fiber, etc., and seeing what our body has to say about it without expecting a guaranteed result, but being open to what we might learn in relation with our microbial communities through the various bodily sensations that we then end up with. So rather than aiming at cure, we might be curious. Okay. So here I have this is the big worry I have when I think about all of this. And I don't have a total solution to it, but I'm putting it out there because it is something I worry about. The worry is that within the current cultural space and current social media algorithms, people exploring their relationship with their gut microbiomes might be drawn to quote unquote wellness subculture spaces that can be full of misinformation and disinformation, including discourse that can lead people into alt-right political beliefs. And this sort of wellness to alt-right slash conspiracy pipeline has been observed for several years. The personal dimension invoked by connect with what your body is saying and try it and see what works for you, which I think is important in the context of our messy bodies and unruly guts, can get distorted when merged with the ethos of the wellness space. So Ciaran Cale in The Guardian describes the wellness movement as, quote, structured around three tenets: robust individualism, distrust of Western medicine, and a commitment to self-optimization, usually through restrictive diets and vigorous exercise regimens designed to stave off disease and death for as long as possible. White nationalists and other alt-right figures find this fertile ground for spreading their views, such that a return to nature and care for the self, it can end up getting linked with eugenic, racist, and xenophobic attitudes. Um, this is not good. Even without going all the way to the alt-right, there are risks of misinformation and just like quackery. We can observe how earlier in the ongoing COVID pandemic, how quickly some untested treatments traveled around social media, and how quickly conspiracy theories formed around scientists like withholding truth. The current push for drinking raw milk in the United States is a particularly salient example. The observation that some microbes are actually beneficial for us, especially in particular proportions, and that our gut microbiome is not well served by an entirely sterile environment, gets twisted into a risky quest to actively seek out more bacteria, including those with an established risk of harm, like E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria. So, what should we do if we want to explore but don't want to fall into conspiracy thinking? This is a big question now, full stop. I think if I had an answer to this, I would be very useful. But I'm going to defer to others who've been working on this sort of science and health disinformation project. But I do have a couple thoughts based on what I have been working on. So, first of all, I think that training ourselves to watch for red flags of ableist and healthist assumptions and undercurrents, as well as expectations of purity and control, like this whole imperative of normalcy in the first place, I think watching for these red flags is an important orienting principle to avoid some of the worst of it. Cultivating curiosity about the relationship between our gut microbiome and our food should involve learning how it all works, including the fact that just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's good. We need to recognize our vulnerability more directly as part of what we are. But also, more to the point, we need to think about the conditions in which we are doing this exploration. As we are essentially vulnerable as embodied beings in the world, we need to think about how we build shared support around this vulnerability. As I've argued previously, while we generally think of dealing with food choices and gut issues as an individual ethical or medical matter, accessibility plays a significant role. Scholars and advocates have drawn attention to issues of food availability, so we can think as well of access to probiotics, prebiotics, fermented foods. We can think of having the time and space to make things. That depends a lot upon one's housing, employment, caretaking responsibilities, sufficient counter space for the sourdough start. Like, I don't even know. Um, and then also, sort of speaking of sourdough starter, we can think about the kind of community contributions through sharing the starters and also making things that other people can try who might be nervous about starting on their own. Even beyond this, though, is how accessible things are around gut issues generally. Gut issues regularly evade control, especially when making diet alterations and trying new foods. And even relatively well-managed conditions can still have flare-ups or require tweaks and alterations as the body changes over the course of a lifetime. Hello, perimenopause. So access to food that adequately nourishes one's gut microbiome is important, but so is a context in which one can try different things to see what works. So if I try a new form of fermented food and it doesn't agree with me, can I be sure I'll have good bathroom access afterward? Like, this is not trivial. This is not trivial at all, especially. So I have in mind steps like taking people seriously when they describe what they need, including people's food requirements. This includes asking what people need to take the burden off them and deciding whether it's safe to bring up or not. Recognizing that timing really matters. Are there particular times of day that can be better or worse? If someone is starting to practice trying more fermented foods, like, do they need, like, can they come into the office a little bit later? Or could they be online for a little while? That sort of thing. Building in flexibility where we can in work and in school, recognizing the unpredictability of gut issues. Advocating for more public washrooms and better access to public washrooms generally and intersectionally for everyone. And generally cultivating an acceptance of gut issues. It's okay if they're sometimes embarrassing. We've all been there, but they don't need to be shameful or perceived as serious moral breaches. We need to cultivate mutual trust and the ability to talk about what does and doesn't work for us. The hierarchical expectations of the imperative of normalcy put the burden on the individual to fix it themselves, but this only makes it harder and pushes people into individualistic optimization mode. Our curiosity can be freer if we support one another through it and acknowledge and create access for the weirdness of our bodies and their microbial communities. I'm really excited about the next two talks, so I'm going to stop here. But thanks again so much to the organizers, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane, also for staying on time. Great. And yeah, I didn't when I began before I said today we are going to host this symposium, but actually the interesting thing is that we're split between, the day line. So the next speaker, Chris Mays, is going to be speaking actually in a way for us is tomorrow. And so thank you also for waking up this early, Chris. So Chris is a senior lecturer in philosophy and the co-convener of the Philosophy and History of Ideas Research Group at Deakin University in Australia. And his research interests include political philosophy, history and philosophy of emerging technologies, and bioethics. He authored The Biopolitics of Lifestyle with Routledge in 2016 and Unsettling Food Politics with Roman and Littlefield in 2018. And he also co-hosts Undisciplinary, a podcast on history, ethics, and politics of health. So the title of his talk today will be Microbes Made Me Do It, Reconfiguring Blame, Stigma, and Responsibility in Human-Microbial Entanglements. Thanks again for getting up early, Chris, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, so I am in the future. So I heard the bit about curiosity that Jane is going to talk about later. So, but really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you all. Let me just make sure my slides are showing. Are they? You can see these, okay?
Works well. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yes, and so I'm at Deakin University. I'm based here in Geelong, which is on the unceded lands of the Wadawurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. And unlike where Jane is, we do not have a treaty, and this land is still contested. And I guess one hopeful point in what is a bleak global development is that the Uruk Commission here happening in Victoria is going to hopefully deliver our first treaty between the settler colonial population and the Indigenous population in Victoria. So this talk, Microbes Made Me Do It. Part of it is, and this isn't just to sort of plug my book from 10 years ago, but it is coming up to a 10-year, it's almost 10 years since to the month that this book was published. And part of the focus of this book, or the main focus of this book, was about lifestyle, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the idea of lifestyle, these sort of daily choices that we do and their effects on health. And what I was wanting to look at in this book was how what I was terming the biopolitics of lifestyle depoliticized political and social relations and turned them into private relations of consumer choice, and individuals are responsible for making their own health decisions and those sorts of things. So rather than any kind of deep collective values and public goods, the network of lifestyle fragments social relations and thins out any idea of public health or public education or collective security. And in this context, society is only a collection of self-governing individuals, just as Margaret Thatcher intended. So something that I did not address in this book, so yeah, I'm partly bringing it up as a bit of self-critique, was epigenetics or the gut microbiomics. Now, partly I was frantically trying to finish this off as I was reading things like Hannah Landecker's 2011 paper on food as exposure. And I, was reading this and thinking I should try to include this, but it was all too late and the publishers were wanting it. So I did not incorporate how epigenetics or microbiomics would alter lifestyle biopolitics, but that's kind of where I'm wanting to sort of think about in this talk and also going forward. And I really appreciate following from Jane's excellent talk because I'm hoping to touch on a few points, and also she really helpfully described what the gut microbiome is, and I won't go into those details except just to pick up on this idea of the hype that is going on around the science. And there's Landecker's 2011 paper. Yeah, so this hype, that the gut microbiome, and I really like this idea. Well, I don't like the idea of the normalcy, but yes, that it is driving towards this sort of self-optimization and normalcy of one's experience of body and health. I guess the one thing I would say in the context of that scientific research and what's going on and in relation to my talk is that the relationship between diet and health is more complex than the idea that was quite dominant when I was writing that book of this, simplistic calorie in, calorie out. And I think that's one of the things that's been interesting with the sort of emergence of some of these microbiomic styles of thinking is that the colonies of microbes in an individual's gut influence how foods are metabolized and thereby influence an individual's physical and mental health. So quite simply, what we eat and how the microbes in our gut process what we eat have, according to the science, profound quality of life outcomes. And, here are a few examples of that, those sort of scientific research on what the gut microbiome promises to address. Now, assuming that the science is correct, or somewhat correct, then the gut microbiome has the potential to radically transform our understanding of individual responsibility for health outcomes. Responsibility and blame are not only integral to moral philosophy, but are connected to how we understand the cause of disease and health. So over centuries, theories of health and disease based on whether it's humours, genes, germs, environment, and so on, have all promoted or relied on different theories of causation and responsibility. So, for example, the simplistic genetic determinism of the 1990s held that single genes cause many complex diseases and conditions, and that when when the genes were identified, they could be modified or neutralized via genetic therapy. So genes were deterministic, and in a sense, obviously this didn't play out in the rhetoric, but the individual was off the hook because, well, my genes made me do it. I guess a title that I'm riffing off with this. My genes made me do it. They are deterministic. Individuals had little control over them. And this idea that the genes made me do it is the title of several books and articles and has been used in many different sort of CSI crime shows, as well as legal defenses to diminish or limit an individual's responsibility. Yet this simplistic understanding of genes and health was modified by epigenetics in the 2000s, whereby the environmental exposure and individual behaviors played a role in gene expression. So food became a source of exposure, as Landecker and others have shown. And as such, individual agency and responsibility were reinserted as contributing to health outcomes. So this, I'd say the turn to epigenetics actually reinforced and tightened some of those lifestyle rhetoric screws, if you like. So lifestyle as a biopolitical governing device incorporated these epigenetic knowledges and sciences, and the individual was responsibilized again. So now, as I imagine is apparent to most of us here, whether individuals can be held responsible for complex health conditions is an ethically charged issue that has been debated in bioethics, and I'd say that's an area that I'm primarily dealing with here: bioethics, public health, sociology of health literatures. However, these literatures, and again, primarily I'm thinking here of bioethics, while they've focused a lot on genetics and to a lesser extent environmental influences on disease, there's been only a few exceptions that have dealt with microbiomics and its implications for responsibility. So today, the gut microbiome arguably possesses a radically different challenge to responsibility than either genetics, epigenetics, lifestyle, or the social determinant concepts of health and disease. So it's not just that external influences, so whether I lose my job or have poor access to health resources or other external influences like exposure to toxins, or internal factors such as my genes, or then my own behaviors, so what I eat. It's not just that all of these condition our responsibility, but a colony of microbes that arguably has its own agency or form of agency within the gut and has the potential to influence health and behavior with some degree of independence from me or from the host, this transforms traditionally, what we think about as responsibility. So if the title of a popular microbiome book uh, suggests, I contain multitudes, then who or what is responsible? The I, the multitudes within me, or is it a negotiation among us? And how do the social as well as the microbial determinants of health change the way we think about responsibility? So, in thinking about some philosophical responses to this, one, I guess, straightforward approach would be to say that we aren't responsible. So one approach is to deny the existence of free will, which is required for moral responsibility. So for popular author Sam Harris and other moral philosophers like Greg Crusoe and Dirk Pereboom, neuroscience, and I would add microbiome sciences, provide an additional empirical evidence to support their theoretical arguments that humans do not have the required moral agency for desert-based moral responsibility. There is no meaningful free will, according to these authors, and therefore there is no meaningful sense of moral responsibility. Now, while these arguments may have value and interest, especially among analytic moral philosophers, it does not do much, I think, for the socio and historical reality of responsibility. So free will and responsibility may not exist as real things as part of the furniture of the universe, but ultimately drawing on perhaps a somewhat, or admittedly drawing on a somewhat controversial analogy, perhaps responsibility is like race. So similar to Paul Taylor and Kamisha Russell's argument that race is a non-biological social reality, responsibility has a social reality that is historically embedded in the background against which we live our lives. The social reality of responsibility is embedded in our medical, educational, political institutions. So if we understand responsibility as a socio-historical reality, then we need more than purely theoretical arguments that observe the fact-value divide. So the fact-value divide is often used to demarcate the normative inquiry of moral philosophy and the descriptive inquiry of sociology and social sciences. And traditionally, the latter seeks to know what is, while the former is interested in what should be. But in recent years, and I suspect this isn't news to many of you, there has been scholars on both sides have sought to disrupt this divide. So empirical ethicists are embracing the social sciences methods to inform and ground normative claims. But there's also been a normative turn among sociologists, anthropologists, and others rejecting the doctrine of value neutrality and using social inquiry to make normative judgments. And I think this approach is particularly promising and needs to be used to address some of these ideas of responsibility around things like microbiome. And some of that research, I think, in Jane's talk points itself to this and lends itself to this, I would think. So in combining the normativity of bioethics with empirical insights from science and technology studies, sociology, or neuropsychology, I believe that we can develop an empirically grounded normative ethical analysis that incorporates these insights of the microbiome researchers with the experiences of those using gut health sciences in their daily lives to examine how responsibility operates in that social reality. So in short, social media, lifestyle media, doctors, and so on tell people that they are responsible for their health outcomes. As the gut microbiome discourses intermingle with these lifestyle discourses, it will be important to investigate how individuals are characterized as responsible in relation to the microbial world, for what outcomes and under what circumstances. Now, I haven't done this yet, but it's something I'm sort of wanting to move on to be doing. But in the remainder of this talk, I want to look at what I think is at stake, or some of the things that are at stake regarding responsibility and the microbiome. So what is at stake? So one of the questions is, who is the responsible subject? So a main point of agreement regarding the way gut microbiome changes conceptions of responsibility is that it disrupts or reconfigures a stable, responsible subject. And this has been touched on in a few of the articles addressing microbiome and responsibility. So HubSwort, for instance, in a 2020 blog post writes, we are ecosystems inhabited by millions of organisms who are part of us. We have a microbiome, but at the same time, our microbiome is part of what we are. And later says, humans are not insulated entities, but the outcome of multiple interactions with microorganisms, both indigenous and external. This has consequences beyond biology. Or more specifically, Christian Hens and Eman Ahmed say the microbiome may challenge an atomistic view of human beings. And later they say primarily Western conceptual certainties about the biological basis of our identity and sense of self are being challenged. So there are other examples in this literature. But the general point is that a number of philosophers have noted the way the microbiome destabilizes and broadens the sense of self and identity inherited by the Western, or more appropriate, liberal capitalist traditions. So we need to move beyond. Here is my daughter. It is morning here in Geelong. So we need to move beyond the responsible I. So the implications of this are varied. So for Zwart, we need to consider stewardship and the breakdown of this binary between good and bad microbiomes. For Hens and Ahmed, we need to consider the implications beyond the microbiome to break down anthropocentric and ecocentric approaches to develop an ethics from the perspective of the I'm not very good at pronouncing this word, holobiont, so the holistic biosphere in which we are part of. Elsewhere, my co-author Nikolai Morat and I have argued that the microbiome means that we need to rethink the many ethical and legal concepts that rely on a demarcation between human and the more than human world. But in concluding, I would like to focus on the broadening of the responsible subject. So as mentioned, moral responsibility is the idea that if individuals are capable of making free and informed choices, then they can be blamed, praised, or held accountable for the consequences of those choices. Now, whether it is true or not that we contain agental multitudes, we are situated in an eco-social milieu that has rightly been identified as providing empirical and conceptual link to indigenous ways of thinking about human and the more than human world. So a number of those people who talk about that the microbiome destabilizes our conception of the self say that this links up to a lot of indigenous understandings of the self. So, for instance, Carl White's idea of multi-species systems of responsibility has valuable resonance with potential shifts in conceptions of responsibility that take human microbial relations seriously. White, a philosopher and citizen Potawatomi Nation member, calls for a forward-looking framework of justice that addresses historical injustices against Indigenous communities, ecologies, and the more than human world, aiming to support the continued flourishing of tribal communities, and criticises liberal environmental justice for overlooking Indigenous relational ontologies and intrinsic value of ecosystems. Now, this move to the microbiome would, in certain ways, have an alliance with some of these perspectives. Central to White's work is this idea of collective continuance, So the adaptive capacity of a society based on its interdependent relationships. So food systems are vital to this as they rely on ecological networks that provide nutritional, spiritual, and cultural care that enable adaptation together. So, for instance, the Karuk people's survival is tied to salmon ecologies. Salmon is integral to their identity and treaty rights. They have the saying, without salmon, there is no treaty. And so settler colonial policies have disrupted these ecologies through mining and bans on fishing in these areas. So in this framework, interspecies relations are foundational to community and future-oriented responsibilities. So justice is embedded in these systems of responsibilities, the roles and relationships that make obligations meaningful. So these systems include the more than human world and expand environmental justice beyond human impacts. So I'm suggesting here that this perspective, perspective offered by gut microbiome provides opportunities not only for developing ethics with Indigenous theories, but also to reconnect bioethics and these other sort of moral philosophies with traditions within the Western perspective. So I'd also sort of critique this sort of Western, non-Western binary. So, and I'm not suggesting this is a list of my favorite people, but for example, Aristotle, Thomistic, Hegelian, Marxist, feminist, and communitarian approaches to ethics and politics are all highly suspicious of the atomistic individual that rationally chooses in abstraction from social, political, and historical contexts. So the responsible subject that the microbiome potentially destabilizes is not Western anthropos in general, but Homo economicus, the atomized rational chooser of liberal capitalism. And unfortunately, the conception of the human subject, unfortunately, this conception of the human subject, this atomized rational chooser of liberal capitalism, has powerful backers. A change to this conception of the individual runs counter to dominant Western capitalist narrative, supported by capitalist conceptions of a property-owning subject. The individual as contained, buffered, and responsible is upheld. There is an extensive literature pointing out that the social, economic, genetic, epigenetic, and now microbiomic factors condition an individual's capacity to take responsibility for health choices. Yet these knowledges are continually repurposed and redeployed into a lifestyle network that denies historically constituted issues of social and microbial determinants of health, that depoliticizes public health by reducing health and welfare to individual choices and commercial opportunities. It seems that the current interest in gut microbiome is another opportunity to collectivize responsibility and communal care, or collective continuance, to use White's term. In reconfiguring responsibility and expanding our sense of health equity, that not only accounts for the uneven distribution of education, employment, and nutritious food, things that have long been included in the social determinants of health model, we can also focus on the uneven distribution of microbes that contribute to health and well-being. More work is needed, as indicated, particularly in combining the theoretical empirical methods, an approach that I hope will enable important developments in moral responsibility that remove burdens from those individuals and communities who are constantly manipulated by government, public health, and commercial actors to accept responsibility for outcomes beyond their control and determined by others. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Wow, very rich also this, and thank you also for staying on time as well. So this leaves us to move to our last speaker, last but not least, Lisa Heldke. And I think Lisa is going to speak or show us also this book that exists that just came out. It's actually the first book in a series on philosophy of food. So Lisa is professor of philosophy at Gustavus Adolphus College, and she's the author or editor of several works in the philosophy of food, starting with Cooking, Eating, and Thinking, Transformative Philosophies of Food, and more recently ending precisely with the parasitic personhood and the ontology of eating. She's an avid consumer of the products of fermentation, as well as a passionate novice producer of several. So the title of her talk today will be Chomping unto Death, a parasitic conception of human personhood. Lisa, thanks again for being here, and yeah, the floor is yours.
All the buttons. I will share my screen, and also I just put into the chat a link I am going to read, and I'm aware that for many of you, it is a time of day and a language that is not your friend. So please feel free to read along with me. Okay. Now, am I sharing? That look good? Can people see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
yes.
Thank you. So, wow. So I'm Lutheran, and one of the places that I immediately go is feeling like, wow, I'm singing out of the same hymn book. But first, let me say thank you so much to Andrea for giving me the honor of having this book be in this series. And thanks to you and all of the folks who have created Culinary Mind, which is just such a wonderful opportunity. I mean, it's just such a delight to be in such a group of people. I live on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people, where there are indeed remnants of Eli Clare's tall grass prairie. I can see some right on my campus, in fact. And yesterday I was in a discussion with some philosophy colleagues / students about what if pooping were a collective activity? And so I feel like, I'm right in and one of them is here today. So hi, Gavia. And then finally, we were also talking about the fact value divides. So I feel like, wow, we're in the sweet spot. So thank you very much. I'm going to go. So I just finished this book. It asks what happens to I'm trying to reduce me. What happens to my everyday understandings of what it is to be a person, and more generally, to be an individual living being, if I take seriously the fact that parasitism is the most common life form on the planet, that more living beings spend at least part of their life cycle in a persistent biological relationship in which they derive some basic need by depleting another organism than in any other kind of relationship. And like so many intellectual projects, this one blindsided me. I thought I was doing something else, and then suddenly I realized I am food. So we are living, as we've heard, in an explosion of interest, scientific and popular, in the microbiome and in parasites in particular. Everyone from academic researchers to home fermenters, I'm saying this to people who know this, is exploring the microbial world. Their activities involve everything from studying the microbiota of soil and the human gut to trying to optimize the conditions for pickling vegetables and making sourdough. Biologists such as Scott Gilbert draw on this research into the microbial world to redefine the biological individual. He says we are all lichens, by which he means that the biological individual is actually a collection of organisms, each of which contributes to the fundamental life processes of what he calls the multicellular eukaryote, plus its colonies of persistent symbionts. And again, you heard biologist's name for this is the holobiont. When I encountered it, I found this relational model compelling but lacking teeth. The holobiont seemed composed only of relationships that promoted the thriving of that eukaryote at the center of it all. But by this time, I'd encountered Michel Serres, and I was thinking about the way in which much of the natural and social world would be better characterized as parasitic than as mutualistic. Serres was what you might call an early adopter of the philosophical relevance of parasitism. This book is from 1980. It first led me to consider the metaphorical or symbolic power of parasites. What if we understood the dichotomy between self and other as a parasitic relationship? What would follow? I'm sorry, I should have issued some apologies for do I need a trigger warning for these pictures? Meanwhile, in the disciplines of ecology and evolution, attention to parasites has increased dramatically in the last decade or so. Watching from the bleachers, I learned that parasitic relationships make up a vast and significant part of the natural world, and that parasitism is far more than a pestilence, responsible for nothing but misery and death. I came to understand that the parasite was far more than metaphorically relevant. I came to be convinced that any ontology of individual personhood would have to somehow wrestle with the reality of it. So this focus on parasites means that this is a moment that is all about eating and being eaten, about persistent biological relationships involving the precarious and destabilizing exchange of nutrients. What are the implications for our conceptions of personhood, of taking this seriously? What are some models for such a conception? Not foods as substances with essences, not lichens either, something with teeth, at least metaphorical ones. And here are two of my favorite contenders, two parasitic fungi that happen to be delicious. So that's the backstory. That's how I came to do parasite ontology. In the remainder of my time, I want to offer a micro sketch of my argument for why our model of individual personhood needs the biting, disequilibrating qualities of parasitism. So in The Parasite, Sayre invites us to notice the astounding commonness of parasitic relationships in our natural and social worlds, and to start our understanding of those worlds from parasites rather than regarding parasites as problems or disruptions to be explained out of existence. Sayre's account of the parasite encouraged me to attend to the messiness, the blurred boundaries and the precariousness of identity that result when one organism latches onto another and takes nourishment from it, to treat it as elemental, as constitutive. Such chomping in relationships, as I call them, are not exceptions, accidents, or anomalous situations in a life. They are the ordinary, the ubiquitous, the common, the unremarkable fabric of life itself. The parasite was my ontological wake-up call to notice an elemental feature of our lived reality, namely the pervasiveness of eating and being eaten into, and the instability and messiness and unbracketable connectedness of these relationships. To be is to be eaten on, eaten into, eaten up. I came to think that conceptions of personhood that define it always and only in terms of thriving are incomplete and actually implausible. Sayre drove home the fact that parasitic relationships are constitutive. Inspired by him, I've been pursuing a kind of experiential ontological inquiry, asking myself, what if I didn't consider the parasite an odd, disturbing problem? I've been trying to live my everyday encounters in the world as if parasitic relationships were elemental in the ontology of me, but let it be said, I do not drink raw milk. What if their destructiveness did not render parasitic relationships beside the point of the individual? What if rather we regarded parasitism as a relationship in terms of which we explain all others? At what kind of ontology do we arrive if we include as constitutive of the individual relationships that threaten existence as well as those that promote it? Oh, I just made my screen go small for a moment. Sorry about that. There's always another button to push, right? What if we understood parasitism as a kind of basal relationship, a relationship in terms of which we can see what it is to be as something, and in terms of which we conceptualize other relationships, rather than the thing to be explained away or set aside as either beside the point or exceptional? What if it, this troublesome, even life-threatening category, were the category in terms of which we conceived other forms of relationality? Such musings had led me to a paradoxical suggestion. Understand the individual relationally and conceive of the relationships that constitute the individual by way of parasitism. And I would extend that to that constitute our relations with other, macroorganisms. Position parasitism in the thick of our ontological understanding of the individual person. Do not flinch from the consequences of that action. Such an acknowledgement leaves us in an altogether different ontological launching point from the one we inherit on a substance ontology, but dramatically different too from the one we inherit from a more bucolic relational perspective. It requires us to grasp the reality that living things eat each other persistently, regularly, of necessity. It requires us to interrogate our horror at the parasite, our wish to eliminate it. Our conceptions of the individual cannot avoid coming to terms with this. As Sayre notes, parasitic relationships are not bad or sick or wrong. They simply are. Here's something I tell anyone who sits still long enough for me to do so. Among living organisms, plants, fungi, bacteria, pretty much the whole tree of life, parasitic relationships are anything but rare or eliminable. And if spending time chomping at something else is a vital part of the life cycle of myriad creatures, that also means spending time being parasited is a part of the life cycle of a non-inconsiderable number of organisms as well. A recent excavation of a Bronze Age site in Britain, for instance, revealed a quantity of coprolites that provided abundant evidence that the people living there must have eaten a diet heavy in raw aquatic animals. The evidence? The human's feces were filled with the eggs of various parasites known to infest fish and frogs and humans and to grow to enormous length. Is parasitism then a deeply relevant part of humans' life cycle? Well, yes, though obviously not in the sense that it's relevant for the hookworm or the leech. For an organism with a parasitic stage, that stage is often essential for its continuation, but for the host, this stage might prevent or at least hobble it. So it's relevant to us in a kind of booby trap way. Given the sheer prevalence of parasitic relationships, if we're going to understand individuals as complex sets of intermingling relationships, parasitic ones must be a part of the story, part of the life story, not only for parasites, but for their hosts. Because, of course, our life story is really best understood as a life and death story. We need to imagine deeply contextual relationships that are sometimes beneficial to us, sometimes harmful, or just plain harmful, but not going anywhere. Our everyday labels, as well as our biological categories and descriptions, encourage us to ignore such relationships by taking forms that those descriptions cannot begin to account for. What's the label for a sometimes harmful, sometimes helpful relationship, for instance? Relationships are parasitic or mutualistic because they are parts of networks that set up conditions that make them so. Organisms possess properties in or as relation. Properties, organisms, emerge out of relationships. Over time, those relationships might move from parasitic to mutualistic or vice versa. And for any given host organisms, its relationships with its colonies within can and do shift in all sorts of ways, as you know, as the other two speakers have both talked about. Today's parasite sometimes becomes tomorrow's mutualist. A relationship with a microbe that presently depletes us might evolve into one that promotes our thriving. Considered over the long haul, we can't separate the helpful from the harmful relationships. So if you insist on a definition of personhood that must remain focused on human flourishing and thriving and must include the holobiont in the holobiont only relationships that support such flourishing, your relational conception of personhood will have to take a very long and complicated view of flourishing. On the other hand, adding parasitic relationships to the list of those that might constitute the human holobiont acknowledges our vulnerability. Here is a category of relationships that can be, and in the history of humans often has been, a precipitator of our death, but has also sometimes miraculously, counterfactually, cantankerously been the catalyst of, or engine for, or preserver of our life. But isn't it ill-conceived to ground personhood in a relationship that causes such destruction and destabilization of a human? Shouldn't our conception focus only on relationships that promote persons' continued existence? No. To state the obvious, we living organisms don't only persist. Indeed, dying is far more of a sure thing for an organism than is flourishing. Every organism dies, every organism experiences depletion, but not every organism flourishes. Furthermore, only living beings die. Dying is actually something very special about us. Ought not our philosophical conception of the individual come to grips with this fundamental feature of our being? To be is to experience precarity and eventually to die. Parasitic relationships root us in that precarity, both literally and symbolically. We will not have moved far enough away from an atomistic substance conception of human personhood if we continue to center life and shut out diminishment and death. I maybe want to rethink that word diminishment. A relationship that can thwart, disrupt, threaten, weaken, and even end a host's existence speaks in a way that billiard balls cannot to something undeniable about human being, about the being of any living thing. It offers a fuller understanding of what it is to be than does a conception focused on thriving. Parasitic relationships speak to the perverse reality of life. Flourishing and faltering are both parts of what we do, and both are enabled in different ways by parasitic relationships. Indeed, that description makes parasitism a rather apt metaphor or model or symbol or whatever it is for the condition of being alive in general, and for the human condition most poignantly and in particular. When we really concentrate on the relationship between life and death, on the relationship that is, rather than on life or on death, the characteristics that take center stage are, I think, precarity and vulnerability. To be alive is to be a vulnerable being in a precarious situation. But take notice, precarity and vulnerability are not synonymous with chaos and death. A precarious situation is not one of complete disorder. A situation can only be described as precarious if it is threaded through with strands of stability, reliability, constancy, dependability. Likewise, to be vulnerable means that you are in fact alive, that you perhaps have possibilities of continuing to be so. Death, yes, is always on the horizon, but as Monty Python might have put it, you're not dead yet. Just as stability is threaded through the relationship that is precarity, so too is continuation threaded through vulnerability. Precarity and vulnerability are thus qualities that embody or represent the relationship of the life-death dichotomy. I suggest that we begin our reconceptualization of parasitism from this relationship. I believe that such a reconceptualization would be a better starting point from which to make room for the ambiguity and complexity of those ongoing biological interactions. It would be able to account for the common ordinary situations in which harm and benefit twine around each other and arise from the same relationship. At the heart of parasitic personhood lies precarity, by which I mean a fragile, might be toppled stability that is laced with the ingredients that could topple it, but that might also turn out to strengthen it. Built into this are the following: an acknowledgement that to be a living thing is to die, to be vulnerable, to be is also to be the instrument of others dying, however small. These are unavoidable features of being alive. At the same time, an acknowledgement that to be alive is generally to struggle to continue to do so. Living things tend to work to persist. A recognition of the deep, almost ludicrous interdependence between those two forces that seem so at odds with each other. It is a truism, but in being a truism, it can come to be invisible or to be trivial. But living and dying feed on each other materially and conceptually, literally and figuratively. Precarity isn't quite built into the ordinary definition of parasite, but it's implicit in that definition, which is written to emphasize life giving on one side and death dealing on the other. We can tend to see life as hermetically sealed away from death, and death as the utter negation of absence or absence of life. But on closer inspection, parasitism acknowledges both the thwarting and the thriving. As a relationship, it acknowledges both life and death. From here, the hop to precarity is a short one. Defining it in terms of precarity places life and death in relation to each other as Sayre might have, biting into each other in such a way that at any point the death dealer might become the life giver, and vice versa. Life and death are born out of the relationship with tooth marks already in the flanks of each. Rather than emphasizing life-giving or death-dealing, I'm suggesting a conception of parasitism that emphasizes their interconnectedness, which expels precarity. This notion doesn't deny or disregard or seek to erase either of those, life-giving or death-dealing, but it makes them, if this is the right word, secondary to the precarity, or perhaps emergent from it. It understands them in terms of precarity, not the other way around. Neither life nor death requires accounting for. Neither occurrence is anomalous or a failure. Neither is understandable except in relationship to each other. So parasitism is the basal relationship, and precarity is the basal feature of it. Precarity says, well, you never know. It depends. It could go either way. You can tell I'm from Minnesota. Precarity acknowledges and leads one to understand that weakening is no more in need of accounting for than thriving. As such, parasitism as precarity seems to account well for relationships among living things, and thus for what it is to be a living thing. So in the end, am I really just saying we all eat, and when we do, stuff dies? Well, in a way, yes, I am. But I'm suggesting that we embed that acknowledgement in an ontology that addresses the degree to which to be is to eat and be eaten, literally and figuratively. And I will just end, oh shoot, I didn't end with the cool slide of my new favorite parasitic mushroom, which is the complicated lobster mushroom. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Here we go.